Alfred Russel Wallace is officially the co-discoverer of human evolution. Wallace was born in a small town on the Welsh border in 1823. He experienced a largely uneventful middle-class English upbringing. In young adulthood, for a period of 6 years, Wallace apprenticed with his older brother as a geographic surveyor in the English and Welsh countryside. In his spare time, Wallace indulged his passion for botany, collecting and naming various plant species. Wallace was a voracious reader. He would spend hours at the local library during downtimes in the surveying business. He read all the top sociology and science books of the day, including Principle of Population by Thomas Malthus and Charles Lyell, Principles of Geology. He even read the writings of radical American revolutionary Thomas Paine, which would have a great influence on his political views later in life. One book that particularly captivated Wallace was a popular selection of the time, authored by a fellow young naturalist, Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. Inspired by Darwin's tales of world travel, Wallace and his friend Henry Bates planned to set out on their own voyage. They traveled to Brazil to collect specimens in the Amazon. Adventurous young men of the 19th century could earn a fortune by collecting and selling exotic plants, insects, and animals to affluent collectors. These voyages were known as collecting trips. Wallace and Bates landed at the northeast Brazil port of Belém. They spent 6 weeks in Belém gathering essential supplies, including camping gear, medicines, sugar, flour, and tools for collecting and preserving specimens. They then headed into the Brazilian interior and the Amazon. They used a popular book of the day by American writer William Henry Edwards, Up the Amazon River, as their guide. After 2 years of exploration and a particularly severe bout of jungle illness, Wallace decided it was time to return to England. Bates, however, stayed on. He would later author a widely acclaimed book of the time, The Naturalist Up the River. Darwin himself would later praise the book as one of the greatest books ever written on naturalism. Wallace set sail for England, his ship laden with invaluable specimens he had painstakingly gathered over 2 years in the Brazilian jungles. On the 26th day of the voyage, on board the Helen, a horrible tragedy struck. Wallace's ship caught on fire and sunk. According to biographer Andrew Barry at Nature 2023, Wallace's first expedition ended in flames. The cause of the fire was friction igniting poorly stowed materials. Wallace endured 10 harrowing days adrift in a lifeboat. He and 10 other survivors were finally rescued by a passing ship. Unfortunately, all his meticulously gathered collections were lost to sea. Wallace back home in England. Wallace was near penniless. He wrote some articles about his adventures, which eventually gained him some income. Wallace's trip had been insured, so eventually he did gain some funds for a future expedition. After his catastrophic loss, Wallace found renewed motivation and inspiration to continue his scientific studies, thanks to the unwavering support of his sister, Fanny. Note aside, Fanny Wallace was an active spiritualist. Her interest in spiritualism likely influenced Wallace's own exploration of the field, which he later integrated with his scientific work. After spending 2 years at home in England, Wallace set sail once again. This time he embarked on the adventure of a lifetime to the Malay Archipelago. Wallace in the Dutch East Indies. Wallace arrived in Singapore in 1854, just in time to witness the brutal riots between rival ethnic Chinese factions. These violent clashes, also known as an Opium War, left hundreds dead and underscored the fierce struggle for control over the lucrative trades. Beginning in 1855, Wallace spent nearly a decade on a collecting trip island hopping throughout the Malay Archipelago. He traveled by steamboat, canoe, horseback, and on foot. Sometimes he had a travel companion, other times he trekked solo. Unlike his previous voyage, Wallace's specimens made their way back to England unharmed. He was able to afford his upkeep and further travels throughout the East Indies. It was on the island of Ternate, off the western coast of New Guinea, where Wallace eventually established his home base. Wallace purchased a bamboo hut in Ternate City. He even had a pet orangutan for a while. Makassar Straits. The Makassar Strait contains a deep-sea trench that separates Sulawesi from Borneo, with a depth of approximately 2,500 meters. Andrew Barry, Wallace Radical, Nature 2013. He wrote, quote, "How Wallace's. When the Linnaean Society of London hears the case for natural selection in 1858, Wallace and Darwin share the credit. Wallace graciously acknowledged his secondary role in the discovery of natural selection. He later praised Darwin's seminal work, even admitting that he couldn't have crafted a more eloquent piece than On the Origin of Species. But he remains officially the co-discoverer of evolution by natural selection. And in our next installment on Alfred Russel Wallace,